starting a new book, Lunar Outfitters, Making the Apollo Spacesuits by Bill A. Ray. A-Y-R-E-Y. Picture. Could read the table of contents out loud. I will say there are parts 1, 2, and 3. Preface. This book tells the story of ILC, International Latex Corporation Industries, one of the many companies that contributed to the success of the Apollo space program, and the unique product this relatively small organization developed and manufactured. The Apollo spacesuit would appear in the most iconic images, used to represent the technological boom of the 20th century, more important to the astronauts who wore them. The suit was a miniature spaceship that enabled them to walk on the surface of the moon without fear of failure. Just 15 layers of thin fabrics and films, sewn, taped, and cemented together provided the barrier they needed. If this garment failed, the astronauts would certainly die. The men and women of ILC Industries knew that the lives of these astronauts were in their hands. They never shrank from that responsibility. Indeed, they embraced it. Like many of my generation, I was caught up in the space race, building plastic model rockets and watching TV as astronauts in successive missions climbed down from their lunar modules and walked, hopped, and even fell about the lunar surface in those impressive suits. I felt a special bond to all the missions because, coincidentally, I lived in a neighborhood where several of the ILC spacesuit engineers and managers also lived. The suits were made within 2 miles of my home. Just a few years after the Apollo program ended, in 1977, I came to ILC for what I expected to be a temporary job, intending to save money and return to college for another degree. My first assignment consisted of pulling materials through a sewing machine while the operator stitched together large panels ILC was manufacturing for United States Air Force airships. Shortly after starting the job, I happened to see many seemingly discarded Apollo spacesuits hanging on a rack in a dark corner of the plant. It was the kind of image an artist or photographer would have relished the chance to capture. In a better lit and more active section of the building, most of the same engineers who designed the Apollo suits had moved on and were now fully engaged in designing the new spacesuit for the upcoming space shuttle program. It didn't take long for me to realize that this was a rather unique company. With jobs expanding quickly at ILC, I soon found other opportunities beyond pulling fabric through the sewing machine. My admittedly lukewarm desire to pursue a degree in psychology was quickly fading away. I was hired into the test laboratory by Tom Sylvester, who had spent many of his earlier years as a test subject trying out the latest Apollo spacesuit designs. Ultimately, I became the manager of the test labs and became responsible for the testing of the materials and the completed spacesuits, as well as all the other company products. Given my love for the manned space program and my interest in everything mechanical, that temp job had evolved into a dream come true for me. Around the time of the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11, I appointed myself as company historian when ILC supported a 9-month display commemorating the event at the University of Delaware Museum. Following the exhibit, all the items came back to ILC, and I found an abandoned room to put them on a more permanent display. The display, which proved to be a hit with customers and visitors, had expanded to include many other company products that are almost as unique as the spacesuits themselves. The exhibit opened the door to collecting stories from many of the ILC veterans, as well as the original documentation from those years that backed up their stories. My hope is that this book will provide the details that have, until now, been locked away in obscure files and in the minds of those who worked the program. I was fortunate to have access to thousands of the original Apollo files, and I am grateful I can share them with you and can look back upon the historic chapter in American history that we call Apollo and marvel at it all. Whether you are a space nut or simply curious to learn more about the Apollo programs and the suits, or are working in the continuing science and development of spacesuits, I trust this book will be of interest and provide all you seek to gain from it. I dedicate this book to all the employees of ILC Industries who focused on the mission of making the spacesuits that made walking on the moon and returning home safely possible for 12 Apollo astronauts. Their efforts also included non-lunar suits for the command module pilots and the suits for our first space station astronauts on Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where we linked up in space with the Russians, effectively bringing an end to the space race and the Cold War. These ILC employees worked feverishly for long hours. They missed the Little League games and school plays of their children. Some neglected spousal relationships, resulting in numerous divorces. That's just the way it was. NASA had launch schedules to maintain. The employees were caught up in the excitement of clothing the men who would fly to the far-off surface of the moon, and they were thrilled to be part of it. Thanks to every one of you for making one fantastic spacesuit. That's the preface. Now the introduction. At the close of the 20th century, the Pew Research Center surveyed Americans and asked what they felt were this country's greatest achievements since the year 1900. There were a lot of possibilities when you consider all the technological strides we made as a nation during that period. What ended coming out on top, not surprisingly, was advancements in science and technology, and specifically space exploration and humans on the moon. The culmination of our manned space programs produced results that established this nation as the world leader in science and technology. Arguably, the position we occupy today still puts us ahead of other nations, thanks in large part to these early programs. But this leadership and success was not a foregone conclusion. The Soviets initially dominated the race into space, and NASA and the U.S. industrial and aerospace complex faced staggering challenges in their efforts to meet President Kennedy's 1961 proclamation that we would land a man on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. Kennedy delivered that speech only 20 days after our first astronaut, Alan Shepard, made his 15-minute flight, barely crossing the boundary into space. Kennedy's pronouncement sent shockwaves through those within NASA who knew how difficult it had been just to launch Shepard on his mission. To get men to the moon and back within 9 years was considered a joke by everyone who knew better. The lunar suit. The forerunners of the modern spacesuit were pressure suits developed for early adventurers who flew their airplanes to altitudes higher than the human body could tolerate. Pioneer Wiley Post flew his unpressurized wooden plane to an altitude of 50,000 feet in September 1934, and in the process discovered the jet stream. Those early daredevils knew that they had to have pressurized air to breathe or they would likely not survive. Attempting to pressurize a wooden plane such as Post's would have resulted in catastrophic results, so the best option at the time was to offer a suit that could be pressurized. These first one-off custom-made suits were awkward and hampered mobility when pressurized, but that was okay because they still afforded the basic protection and motion needed. With the advent of high-performance jet aircraft in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the military became very interested in pressure suits for pilots who were flying at increasingly higher altitudes. Again, these suits were designed for a sedentary human seated in an aircraft who only truly needed to move their arms and hands. A small handful of companies offered mass-produced suits for such a purpose, but their focus remained on the aircrew population. True spacesuits didn't receive serious attention until the U.S. manned space program began in earnest. Would the early pressure suits support President Kennedy's challenge to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth? The pressure suits used in the Mercury and Gemini missions were derivatives of the military pressure suits of the 1950s. But even with various modifications, could they meet the challenges of the Apollo missions that were to come? This is where International Latex Corporation, or ILC, stepped up with its design and manufacture of the first suits intended solely for use in space, suits that were not derivatives of military pressure suits. The journey of the Apollo spacesuit begins in 1952 when ILC employee Leonard, or Len, Shepard set out to build the first true spacesuit. 4 years later, George Durney joined him and further developed Shepard's basic spacesuit design through the early 1960s. The team worked tirelessly to make this suit perform better than anything else on the market and ultimately win all the marbles in the contest to be the first to safely deliver a man to the moon and bring him back alive. As the challenges of Apollo grew, ILC Industries hired many people with the great talent to reach each successive level. This next generation included college-trained engineers who had great vision. Spacesuit design was not taught in any of the colleges. Mechanical engineers could transfer what they learned through education and work experience to the world of designing and building rockets and capsules for a space program. But the art of designing and building spacesuits was very abstract in many respects, and only a select few could understand the nuances of it all. There really were no previous spacesuit models to look at. This was all new territory. These garments were 0% fashion and 100% function. Anything fashionable about the suits was arrived at serendipitously. This business wouldn't have succeeded if not for the women who brought the sewing skills that were necessary to stitch together this life-sustaining garment. Theirs was a women-only trade, learned mostly at home from their mothers and solidified through years of experience in the local commercial garment businesses. Some women simply transferred over from ILC's parent Playtex division, where they made bras and girdles. These suits would have to function in an environment that would take human life within seconds. The seamstresses could not fail at their jobs of sewing the seams together properly, and everyone involved in this business was aware of that fact, including the astronauts. Many hurdles faced the men and women who accepted the responsibility of seeing to it that the moonwalking astronauts of Apollo would survive the unknowns of the hostile environment they would face. Some of the more obvious obstacles were described in the following observation I found buried deep within a document written at the time the Apollo suits were being developed. It provides just a slight glimpse into what some of the challenges were. The author, a NASA contracts administrator, was attempting to shed light on the challenges and the unique nature of the work of making the Apollo spacesuits while at the same time justifying the high costs of the suits. It has been correctly observed that the suit is the only spacecraft to go all the way to the moon and back. Designing it to be so versatile that it is comfortable during a 14-day mission for intravehicular wear and also provide extravehicular capability to let an astronaut on the moon's surface leap, climb, and creep, place his hands on top of his helmet, reach behind his back, and touch the opposite shoulder with either hand with 100% safety is no easy engineering job. It required the expertise of a strange blend of such diverse disciplines as bioengineering, metallurgy, fluid control, and sewing. After the suit is designed and qualified, there are still many recurring problems encountered in custom fitting the suits to the specific astronaut. First, the pattern cannot even be cut until the crews are selected, which is done at the sole discretion of the astronaut office. Second, ILC is required to physically locate the astronaut, make certain plaster casts, and measure him. Thirdly, after the suit has been cut and stitched, ILC is required to coax the astronaut to Dover, Delaware, for a fit check, at which time special design changes may be generated due to the subject's idiosyncrasies, such as weight fluctuations, 99th percentile bicep, extra long neck, etc. Other problems result from the coordinating, integrating, and interfacing with the other Apollo systems, such as the Portable Life Support System, Command and Service Module, Lunar Module, and the Spacesuit Communications Systems. We have a footnote. Houston, we have a footnote. Actually, it's an end note. Of the several varieties of spacesuits used since the beginning of human spaceflight, the Apollo suits are among the most iconic objects ever photographed, particularly when seen in the photos from the lunar surface. They represent the human species leaving the gravity of Earth and traveling to another world, an absolute first for humankind. Take for instance that famous photo Neil Armstrong took of Buzz Aldrin posing with the magnificent desolation of the moon as a backdrop. Taking it in. As with all the images of the Apollo astronauts taken on the lunar surface, the men who occupied the suits are all but invisible. This is the story of that suit. And it says, Figure 0.1. The iconic photo of Buzz Aldrin taken by Neil Armstrong just minutes after Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Aldrin is wearing the ILC Industries model A-7L spacesuit, courtesy NASA. Chapter 1, Humble Beginnings. School of Hard Knocks. The story of the ILC spacesuit has its roots in the early 1950s, when a small group of hard knockers, as they would call themselves, began developing pressure suits to protect humans in space. Their moniker comes from the term School of Hard Knocks, which means learning primarily from experience, mistakes, and hands-on work, as opposed to gaining knowledge from college or textbooks. That phrase aptly describes these men and women, as they were not part of the formal aerospace organizations that the Air Force or NASA usually dealt with. The company was better known for making commercial products, such as bras and girdles, through a closely tied parent division named Playtex. It probably turned out to be a good thing, because the hard knockers frequently thought outside the box when designing spacesuits and didn't always follow the aerospace community's set of guidelines. The ILC's work on pressure suits followed the success their small division had with developing and manufacturing pressure helmets, such as the model MA-2 for the U.S. Air Force. Post-World War II jet aircraft were flying at higher altitudes, and the demand for crew protection had increased, while the Air Force gave ILC an opportunity to develop the first pressure suits. Those early contracts were just an excuse for ILC to get their spacesuit recognized by industry. It wasn't long before everyone in the business knew the ILC pressure suits as state-of-the-art because they were the best available garments for space travel. The designers of these new spacesuits were truly artists who worked in a very abstract world, as they visualized how pressurized garments would comfortably fit the wearer and, most important, provide complete mobility for arms and legs, which otherwise stiffened because of the air pressure in the suits. They had to invent and integrate all the mechanics to carry this out while working side by side with very skilled women who painstakingly assembled this life-sustaining one-piece garment with their Singer sewing machines. Okay, going to sleep. I'm gonna start there. Stop there.